Barcelona, Spain, 1941. The war was going badly for the Allies. France had already fallen. Britain was standing virtually alone. And a young, failed Spanish chicken farmer, a man who had never worked in intelligence, never been trained as a spy, and never once set foot on British soil, walked into the German embassy and volunteered to spy against Britain. The Germans accepted him immediately. They gave him a code book, a fake identity, and a mission. Then they sent him, as they believed, to London. He never went to London. He went to Lisbon. And from a small apartment, using a Frommer's tourist guide and railway timetables borrowed from a public library, he began fabricating one of the most elaborate intelligence networks in the history of warfare. The Germans thought he was their best spy in Britain. He was working from a Portuguese library, and he was about to save 1 million lives. His name was Juan Pujol García. The British would call him Garbo after Greta Garbo because, in the words of his MI5 handlers, he was the greatest actor in the world. This is the story of the man who never fired a shot and may have done more to win World War II than any general on any battlefield. The Intelligence War. To understand what Garbo accomplished, you need to understand the world he was operating in. By 1940, Nazi Germany had built what appeared to be an impenetrable intelligence apparatus across Western Europe. The WWII, Germany's military intelligence service, had recruited and deployed networks of agents across Britain, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and the neutral nations of Europe. They were feeding Hitler a steady picture of Allied intentions, troop movements, and industrial capacity. On the British side, the security service, MI5, was fighting a losing battle, or so it seemed. The public was gripped by what Churchill called spy mania, a fear that German agents were everywhere, deeply embedded, undetectable. Newspapers fed the panic. Every suspicious foreigner was a potential Nazi sleeper. The reality was almost comically different. Between September and November of 1940, fewer than 25 German agents made it to British soil. Most were poorly trained, barely motivated, and spoke broken English. They arrived by parachute into muddy fields and by rubber dinghy onto windswept beaches and were caught almost immediately. What gave MI5 its decisive advantage wasn't superior manpower or better training. It was something far more powerful. Bletchley Park had cracked the German Enigma code. MI5 often knew the name, arrival date, and mission of an incoming German agent before the man had even packed his suitcase. The MI5 officer who first grasped the full implications of this was Thomas Argyll Robertson, known to everyone as Tar. Robertson had an idea that was either brilliant or insane. What if, instead of simply arresting German spies, Britain turned them? Not to gather intelligence, not as informants, but as weapons, tools to feed a constructed reality directly into the mind of the German High Command. What if Britain didn't just fight the intelligence war, but controlled it? Building the machine. In January 1941, Robertson and an Oxford historian named John Cecil Masterman established what they called the 20 Committee, named for the Roman numeral XX, which is, quite deliberately, a double cross. The 20 Committee had a simple mandate: coordinate every piece of disinformation passed to Germany through every double agent on British soil. Every message, every detail, every lie. Nothing went to Berlin without the committee's approval. The process worked like this. When a German agent arrived in Britain, by parachute, by submarine, by forged passport, MI5 was usually already waiting. The agent was taken to Camp 20, a requisitioned mansion in Richmond, and handed over to Lieutenant Colonel Robin Stevens. Stevens was, by all accounts, terrifying. He wore a monocle. He never raised his voice. He simply dismantled people, their stories, their loyalties, their constructed identities, with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. He didn't use torture. He didn't need to. He had something more powerful. He already knew more about the agent than the agent knew he knew. After interrogation, the agent faced a choice: execution as a spy or cooperation. Very few chose the blindfold. Those who turned became double agents. They were given handlers, safe houses, cover stories, and most crucially, a carefully managed flow of information to pass back to their German controllers. Information that was true enough to be believable, false enough to be lethal. The technique was surgical. Pure fiction would be detected. The Germans weren't fools. So every piece of disinformation was wrapped in a layer of verifiable truth. Real ship movements that had already happened. Real troop rotations that no longer mattered. Real weather, real logistics. Real details that a genuine spy could plausibly have observed. Then buried inside all that truth, the lie that mattered. By 1941, MI5 had achieved something that, in retrospect, sounds almost impossible. In the words of Masterman himself, the British were actively running and controlling the German espionage system in the United Kingdom. All of it, every agent, every message, every piece of intelligence the WWII believed it was receiving from Britain, the British had written it. Garbo enters the machine. Which brings us back to Juan Pujol García and the problem he created for everyone. In the spring of 1941, MI5 intercepted a German naval communication that mentioned a convoy behaving strangely. The Kriegsmarine had dispatched ships to intercept what their spy in Britain had described as a major Allied convoy departing from Liverpool. The convoy didn't exist. The spy's report was fabricated. MI5 launched a full-scale investigation. Someone in Britain, or posing as being in Britain, was feeding the Germans invented intelligence. Who? Why? Was it a rouge operation? A trap? It took months to trace the source. The mysterious informant was a Spanish civilian living in Lisbon, a man with no intelligence training, no government backing, no formal relationship with any Allied service. He had simply decided, on his own, to start lying to Nazi Germany. His name was Juan Pujol García. He had tried 3 times to offer his services to British intelligence in Madrid. 3 times they had turned him away. So he went to the Germans instead, not to actually spy for them, but to establish a cover from which he could deceive them, alone, without support, without even basic tradecraft. For 9 months, from a public library in Lisbon, Pujol constructed an entire fictional Britain. He invented 5 subagents, each with names, personalities, occupations, and locations. He sent the Germans reports filled with just enough real information, drawn from tourist guides, railway timetables, and cinema newsreels to make the fiction plausible. He made mistakes. He once described a contact in Glasgow who would do anything for a litre of wine, seemingly unaware that Scotland measured alcohol in pints, not litres, and that the man's willingness to work for wine was, to say the least, culturally implausible. The Germans never noticed. They were delighted. On April 24, 1942, Pujol arrived in Britain for the first time in his life. MI5 had finally accepted him. He was driven to London, assigned a handler named Tomás Harris, a bilingual Anglo-Spaniard, and given a code name. Garbo after Greta Garbo, because, his handlers concluded, he was simply the greatest actor they had ever encountered. Building the empire of fiction. What Garbo and Harris built over the next 2 years was one of the most elaborate acts of sustained fiction in history. They wrote 6 to 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. Between them, they produced 315 letters, each averaging 2,000 words. More than 500,000 words of constructed reality sent across the English Channel to German intelligence officers who read every line and believed every word. Garbo's fictional network of subagents grew and grew. At its peak, he had invented 28 individuals, each with backstories, personalities, areas of expertise, and access to different parts of Britain. There was a Swiss banker in London, a Venezuelan student with contacts in the Welsh nationalist movement, a Venetian dock worker in Glasgow, a KLM pilot who flew the route between Britain and Portugal, which conveniently explained how letters could be posted from Lisbon with a British postmark. MI5 invested real resources into making the fiction tactile. An officer was dispatched to tour the English countryside, knotting hotel names, pub names, street names, details that Garbo's imaginary agents could describe accurately when asked by their German handlers. The fiction had texture, it had geography, it felt lived in. And the Germans were so satisfied with Garbo's network that they stopped trying to recruit actual spies in Britain. Why bother? They already had the best agent in the world. The credibility of the operation was built through what intelligence professionals call feed, genuine information, deliberately timed to arrive too late to be useful. The test came in November 1942. The Allies were about to launch Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa. This was a massive operation. It could not be kept entirely secret. So Garbo's handler arranged for one of his fictional agents to observe a convoy of troopships leaving a British port, painted in distinctive Mediterranean camouflage. The report was real. The observation was accurate, but the letter was timed to arrive in Berlin 4 hours after the invasion had already begun. The German response was everything MI5 had hoped for. Garbo's handler wrote back, "We are sorry your reports arrived too late, but they were magnificent." The WWII had decided that the delay was the Postal Service's fault, not Garbo's. His credibility was now ironclad. He was the spy who had tried to warn them, the spy who had been let down by circumstance, the spy whose loyalty was beyond question. Operation Fortitude. By early 1944, the Allies were preparing the largest military operation in history, Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied France, D-Day. Everything depended on where the Germans expected it to land. The two main candidates were Normandy and Pas-de-Calais, the narrow strait directly across from Dover, the shortest crossing, the most direct route to Berlin. Pas-de-Calais was the obvious choice, which is precisely why the Allies chose Normandy instead. The deception plan was called Operation Bodyguard, named for Churchill's remark to Stalin, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." Its most ambitious component was Operation Fortitude. Fortitude had two arms. Fortitude North created the illusion of a planned Allied invasion of Norway, tying down more than 10 German divisions in Scandinavia that would never fire a shot on D-Day. Fortitude South was the masterpiece, convinced Germany that the real invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais. To make Fortitude South credible, the Allies constructed an entirely fictional army. The first United States Army Group, FUSAG, existed only on paper and in radio transmissions. On paper, it was 150,000 strong, American, British, and Canadian soldiers massed in southeast England, poised to cross the narrowest point of the Channel and strike Calais. In reality, it was rubber tanks, wooden aircraft, empty camps with lights running through the night, and loudspeakers broadcasting the sounds of military activity loud enough to be heard for miles. At FUSAG's head stood General George S. Patton, the most feared American commander in Europe, not because Patton was available, but because the Germans were already watching him. His victories in Sicily had made him, in German eyes, the obvious choice to lead the decisive strike. Placing Patton at the head of the fictional invasion force was a masterclass in a concept intelligence professionals call Magruder's principle. It is always easier to reinforce what someone already believes than to plant an entirely new idea. The Germans believed the Allies had between 75 and 90 divisions assembled in Britain. The actual number was 37. By early June 1944, Allied codebreakers monitoring encrypted German communications confirmed what they had hoped. FUSAG was appearing in Nazi dispatches, tracked as real, feared as real, planned against as real. This is where Garbo became indispensable. All the rubber tanks and fake radio traffic in the world meant nothing if Germany's most trusted intelligence source, the man they had come to rely on above all others, didn't confirm the picture. And so, through the spring of 1944, Garbo's network of 28 fictional agents reported, from across the length and breadth of Britain, on the massive buildup of Allied forces in southeast England, the army that didn't exist, the invasion that wasn't coming. June 6, 1944. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel and began storming the beaches of Normandy. The deception hadn't stopped, it had accelerated. RAF bombers flew precise circuits over the sea off Pas-de-Calais, dropping clouds of aluminium chaff that created ghost fleets on German radar screens. Small naval vessels moved in coordinated formations beneath. Radar operators on the French coast reported convoys bearing down on Calais. German commanders scrambled to respond to an invasion that existed only as strips of metal falling through the dark. Meanwhile, Allied jamming technology, codenamed Mandrel, masked the real armada. Over 6,000 ships carrying the men who would actually land on those beaches. By the time German commanders understood what was actually happening at Normandy, Allied forces were already ashore. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, and Adolf Hitler, still in bed, having given strict orders not to be woken for any reason, still believed that the real invasion was coming at Calais. His generals begged to release the Panzer divisions, the armored reserves that could have driven the Allies back into the sea. Hitler refused. He was certain Normandy was a feint. The real attack was still coming. Hold the line at Calais. On June 8, under immense pressure, he ordered 17 divisions to move from Calais toward Normandy. Those divisions were already on the road when, on June 9, the order was cancelled. What changed Hitler's mind on June 9? A message from Garbo. Garbo had sent a long, urgent, detailed telegram to his WWII handlers. He had intelligence, he said, from his network across Britain. The Normandy landings were exactly what the Allied High Command wanted the Germans to think they were, a diversion, designed to pull German armor south and leave Calais exposed for the real, massive assault that was still to come. He was certain. His sources were impeccable. The Panzers had to stay at Calais. Hitler believed him. The Panzer divisions that had already begun moving were turned around. They went back to Calais, and they stayed there through July into August, waiting for a second invasion that never came. The window the Allies needed, those critical weeks to land reinforcements, push inland, and consolidate their foothold on the continent, remained open. The man who won the invisible war. 4 weeks after D-Day, MI5 reported to Churchill. It is known for a fact that the Germans intended at one time to move certain divisions from the Pas-de-Calais area to Normandy, but in view of the possibility of a threat to the Pas-de-Calais area, these troops were either stopped on their way to Normandy and recalled, or it was decided that they should not be moved at all. From Berlin, Garbo received a different message. The WWII, still believing he was their most loyal agent, informed him that Adolf Hitler had personally approved awarding him the Iron Cross, second class, the medal usually reserved for soldiers who had fought at the front, for perfect and cherished work in the supreme and decisive hours of the struggle for the future of Europe. The man who had destroyed the German war effort in the West had been decorated by the regime he was destroying. On November 25, 1944, Juan Pujol García received a second decoration, the Member of the Order of the British Empire, from King George VI himself. He remains, to this day, the only person in the Second World War to have been officially decorated by both sides. After the war, Garbo feared reprisals from surviving Nazi networks. With MI5's help, he faked his own death, dying of malaria in Angola, according to official records, and vanished to Venezuela, where he spent the next 35 years running a bookshop, teaching languages for Shell Oil, remarrying, and raising children who had no idea who their father had been. His identity was only uncovered in 1984, when a British journalist traced him through a phone book, calling every J. García in Barcelona until he found a nephew. Pujol agreed to be found. He came to London. He was received at Buckingham Palace by Prince Philip in an unusually long audience. On the 40th anniversary of D-Day, he travelled to Normandy. He walked the beaches. Aging veterans, men who had stormed those sands under fire, recognized him, and formed a line to shake his hand. What it all means. Operation Fortitude, and Garbo at its center, is the most complete demonstration in modern history of a principle that intelligence professionals now consider foundational. Wars are won not only by what you do, but by what the enemy believes. Garbo didn't control Hitler. He couldn't pick up a phone and give orders to the Führer. What he controlled was something more powerful and more fragile than any physical force. He controlled the information from which Hitler constructed his understanding of reality. And in a dictatorship where disagreeing with the Führer could mean death, that constructed reality was the only reality that mattered. This is why the double-cross system was revolutionary. Previous intelligence operations had tried to steal the enemy's secrets. The 20 Committee did something different. They left the enemy's secrets intact and corrupted the enemy's conclusions instead. They didn't need to know what Hitler was thinking. They decided what Hitler would think. The full details of Fortitude remained classified for decades. The identities of the double agents weren't publicly confirmed until the 1970s and beyond. What was built in rubber and radio waves and 500,000 words of constructed lies took nearly 50 years to fully come to light. But the outcome was written on June 6, 1944. The greatest amphibious invasion in history succeeded, not because the Allies were stronger at the point of contact, but because the enemy's most powerful forces were looking in the wrong direction, held there by a ghost army, and by the most audacious lie ever told. And at the heart of that lie, writing 6 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a modest house in Hendon, London, was a failed Spanish chicken farmer with a tourist guide and an almost supernatural gift for making people believe things that weren't true.